Thank you so much for having me to speak here. Thank you for coming along today. I was first invited to speak for the second time at Melting Pot for 2019. That was cancelled. Then again, 2020. Then 2021, that was cancelled. So finally, I'm here 2022, and it feels like there's been so many challenges to get here. And I know that, we're all facing huge amounts of challenge at the moment. There's so many changes that we have to tackle and so many difficulties that crop up that we're not expecting. Well, I'd like to just tell you my story. And by doing so, hopefully I can show you how I've learned over the last 23 years of my life that really whatever challenges you face and whatever your ambitions are, whatever your goals are, whatever your dreams are, really, if you set your mind to something, if you are prepared to put aside the difficulties and just go ahead and give something a go, and to make the most of the things that you have, rather than worrying about the things you perhaps don't have, and make the most of all the things that the incredible people around you have, rather than complaining about what they don't do. And finally, if you can do that one magical thing to believe in yourself, well, then truly anything becomes possible. So, up until, and once the slides start moving, there we go. Up until 23 years ago, I was just a completely ordinary person. There was nothing unusual about me whatsoever. I was just an ordinary guy going about my business, living and working in Edinburgh, Scotland, which is where I'm from. Yay! Thankfully, I don't have a very strong Scottish accent, so hopefully everyone can understand me okay. Even a round of applause for that. Okay. But the only thing that made me stand out from the crowd at all, perhaps, was my great passion in life, which was, of course, mountaineering. And every spare moment that I had, I would rush off into the hills and the mountains and go climbing. But apart from that, I really was just an ordinary person with no idea what was about to happen to me. Well, it was in January 1999 that myself and this guy here, my best friend, my climbing partner, Jamie Fisher, another Jamie, we went to climb a mountain in the French Alps called Les Droites. It's in the Chamonix Mountains, the Mont Blanc Massif of the French Alps, and it's a 4,000-meter mountain, so it's a big peak. But more importantly to us, it's north face, pictured here, this 1,000-meter near vertical wall of snow and ice, rising from the glacier at the foot right up to that spiky summit ridge at the top. It's one of the most truly awesome north faces in the Alps, and it's a climb that all alpinists have on their dream tick lists, not least Jamie and I. So when we arrived in Chamonix that winter to find perfect conditions, blue skies, sunshine, great forecast, great looking climbing conditions, we leapt at the chance to tackle this incredible climb, and off we went. Now, of course, this climb was hard, but nevertheless, it was well within our capabilities. We were a strong team. We'd prepared well for this kind of thing. We were climbing really well together, and we did make very good progress up the mountain face. But it was on this particular climb, on the second day of our expedition, as we approached the summit of the mountain, that our luck started to change. When suddenly, out of nowhere, we were engulfed by a vicious, unexpected, unforecast storm. And before we knew it, we were just battling for our lives. The conditions changed really quickly. The clouds rolled in, visibility dropped down to near zero, the winds started to pick up, snow started falling, avalanches started thundering down all around us, and it's just frightening how quickly the conditions can change. We had no option at this point. There was no chance of making a descent back down the very difficult climb that we'd done. We opted to carry on to the summit dig ourselves in there, wait out the storm, and make the much easier descent down the other side of the mountain first thing the next morning, once the storm had all blown over. But as I said, we were fighting for survival and could barely just cling on to the mountain at this point. So it wasn't until well after dark, climbing by the light of our head torches, that we finally pulled over onto the summit of the mountain. And there we dug ourselves in. We carved ourselves a tiny little icy ledge right on the crest of the mountain, with drops of hundreds of meters to either side of us. And right on the edge, we carved ourselves an icy ledge about 1 meter wide, about 1.5 meters long, just big enough for the two of us to get lying down side by side in a very uncomfortable and cramped position, and to get into our sleeping bags. And there we settled in to wait out the storm. So we waited, and we waited, and we waited, and we waited. And in the end, to cut a long story very short, we ended up trapped on that tiny little icy ledge at the very summit of that 4,000-meter mountain, at the full mercy of the elements for a total of 5 days and 5 nights, just pinned to the spot, enduring temperatures that plummeted as low as minus 30 degrees C, wind speeds of 130 kilometers an hour, conditions the human body just isn't built to survive. Survive we did, though. We did do a really good job at hanging on in there. But ultimately, there's only so much the human body can take. And it was on the 5th and final terrible night that we both ultimately succumbed to the inevitable grips of hypothermia. And it was my friend, Jamie Fisher, beside me, who, for what reason, I don't know, just began to fade faster than me. He at first just became confused, but then more and more he became delirious. Eventually, he became unconscious, and ultimately, he just stopped moving altogether. I, at that point, was still conscious, but I knew this was the end for both of us. There was now no way either of us was getting off the mountain alive. And I remember just closing my eyes and drifting off out of consciousness, thinking that I would never wake up ever again. But sometime later, I did open my eyes again, and I was still there. And when I opened my eyes and looked out, the first thing that I saw was the first rays of sunshine as they lit up all the mountain peaks all around me, now under a clear blue sky. And I realized I'd made it through the dawn, through to the dawn. I'd made it through the night. And that there was still a spark of hope that I might get out of there. And sure enough, it seemed like only moments later I heard the unmistakable thud, 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 thud of the helicopter as it approached. The rescue services had finally managed to get a break to try and reach us. Still, though, they had a hell of a job of it. The winds had barely dropped at all. The helicopter could only just fly, but it couldn't hover anywhere near us. What they managed to do, though, was to make a passing drop of one of their men onto the mountain summit just above us. They dropped this guy off. The helicopter then immediately had to pull back to safety, leaving this guy behind, who immediately sprang into action. He got some ropes out. He abseiled down to where we were trapped, reached us very quickly. And then, realizing that I was still alive, he dealt with me first. He got me ready. He got me prepared in a rescue harness. And then he radioed the helicopter. The helicopter, meanwhile, had prepared its full 40 meters of winch line, but that wasn't going to be nearly enough to clear the turbulence around the mountain. So to that, they had added another 50 meters of rope, on the end of which was attached a single hook. The helicopter then just made one pass straight over the mountain summit, trailing beneath it this 90 meters of line with a hook on the end. And as it flew past, the pilot managed to guide it with such precision that my rescuer on the ground was able to reach up with his hand, catch this hook. As it swung past, he then immediately just clipped it onto my harness, and instantly I was yanked off the mountain. Instantly I was spinning 1,000 meters above the glacier in space, in what was one of the most spectacular and daring rescues in the history of the Alps. Not that I fully appreciated that at the time, but I was still conscious, remarkably. And the last thing that I saw before I finally did pass out, if the slides will go, there we go, was this scene here, taken from the helicopter, looking back. It's not a great picture, but you can make out this tiny little ledge that we were trapped on in this sort of dip in the ridge, with the massive drops to front and back. And the last thing that I saw was the blue-suited figure of my rescuer as he crouched over the now lifeless body of my best friend and climbing partner, Jamie Fisher. So at that point, I knew that I'd made it. I'd been rescued. I was going to live. But I knew also that in no way was this a happy ending, and that I was returning to a very, very different world to the one that I'd left behind just a week previously. Well, I was flown straight to Chamonix Hospital, where I was extremely well taken care of, as you can see in this picture here. Not only was I surrounded by beautiful French nurses, but all of the staff there, the doctors, the surgeons, the nurses, not only were they world experts in the treatment of mountain traumatology, but living and working amongst the mountains as they do. They're all mountain people. They're all skiers and snowboarders and mountaineers. And that meant that they had a great deal of understanding for me as a person. They knew who I was, where I was coming from, what I'd been doing up there on the mountain summit in the first place. And that level of understanding that they had for me, that connection that we had right from the beginning, meant a great deal to me, meant as much to me as their medical expertise. I was also surrounded by my friends and family who flew out to be with me. So in this picture on the left is my dad. Equally, not in the picture, my mum. And on the right, most importantly of all, my girlfriend, Anna. So I was very well taken care of. But still, those were such tough days. Those first few days after the accident were really hard, and I just struggled to come to terms with the sudden, tragic, and unexpected loss of my friend Jamie. And on top of that, of course, I was really quite ill myself. The hypothermia was fine, but the frostbite wasn't fine. In fact, by the time I was brought into hospital, my hands and feet were literally frozen solid, like blocks of ice. And you don't get away with that kind of frostbite without some kind of permanent damage. At this stage, though, the doctors and surgeons couldn't really say how bad that permanent damage might be. All they could do was to defrost me, pump me full of drugs, and then sit back and wait and see which parts of my hands and feet might regenerate, might recover, and could eventually be saved, and which parts would not, would die back, would atrophy, and would eventually have to be amputated. And this period of waiting, I was told, could take many weeks and months and even years. following which there would be many more months and years of reconstructive surgery, rehabilitation, at the end of which one day, perhaps, I might be able to lead some kind of normal life again. But until that point, I just wouldn't know. And to me, that uncertainty was worse than any fate that I could imagine. Simply not knowing what the future held in store for me was what really got me down the most. What I really struggled with most of all was that terrible uncertainty. And so, in retrospect, I think I was actually quite lucky that that period of waiting was cut very short, when after only a week and a half, I became extremely ill with septicemia, blood poisoning. And despite the best efforts of the doctors and surgeons, I fell into septic shock. I had to be intubated, sedated, and essentially held in an artificial coma. And so it was while I was unconscious that these guys, who had been battling so hard, were forced to take the excruciating decision whether to carry on that battle, to give me a chance, but in all probability to see me die, or whether to take action, to go ahead and amputate. And in the end, I think they realized that if they were going to save my life at all, then amputate was what they had to do. And so amputate is what they did. So that's not actually me, in case you're wondering. I don't usually compare myself with Greek gods, but Dionysus here and I, we share the same amputations, 2 below elbow amputations and 2 below knee amputations. So effectively, I lost my hands and my feet. And that was it. Really, that was that. I was to wake up from those operations, to look down my hospital bed and see that where my hands and feet had previously been were now only neatly bandaged stumps. And to say that I wasn't prepared for this shock would be a ridiculous understatement. I mean, nothing could have prepared me for this, for the dawning realization that I was facing the rest of my life without hands and feet, that this was real. This was happening to me. They were never going to grow back again. It really was the rest of my life. And to begin with, the prospect just seemed too appalling to even contemplate. You know, I couldn't even begin to imagine how I could ever lead any kind of meaningful existence in this condition ever again. And I must admit, there were times during those first few days and weeks when I truly felt that I would have been just better off dying up there on the mountain summit alongside my friend Jamie, rather than coming down to face a life like this. So those were dark, dark days indeed. And of course, on top of all that, I was still really struggling to come to terms with what had happened to Jamie. And struggling with all the strange and difficult emotions that went along with that. You know, emotions such as anger. Anger at myself. Anger at Jamie for not having made it down alive. And guilt. Guilt at having survived when he hadn't. Guilt at having got down alive from our ordeal together when he hadn't. But in the end, it was those emotions relating to Jamie which actually helped me to begin at least to come to terms with what had happened. Because it was through thinking about him and eventually through talking about him that I came to realize that really the most important thing here was that I was still alive. I had been given a second chance. Jamie, who had so sadly died up there on the mountain, hadn't been so fortunate, hadn't been as lucky as me, hadn't been given this second chance. And so I made up my mind that I very much owed it to him, as much as I owed it to everyone who'd fought so hard to save me, as much as I owed it to myself, to make the most of this second chance, just to give it a go and to find out what was possible without hands and feet, just to treat it like my next big challenge, to treat it like the next big mountain that I had to climb. And so that's what I resolved I was going to do. I made up my mind that this day here was going to be the low point in my life, and that every day from this day on, I was somehow going to get better. I was somehow going to improve. I had absolutely no idea how I was going to go about this or what I might achieve. And maybe I make it sound like it was an easy resolution to come to. Well, of course it wasn't. And it wasn't one that happened overnight. Indeed, it did take many weeks and months and years, really, before I truly came to terms with what had happened. But the most important step was taking that positive outlook right from the beginning, resolving to somehow find the positive in this situation and bring it out. So with that in mind, I was soon well enough to be flown back to hospital in Edinburgh. And there I began this amazing journey of rehabilitation, this incredible voyage of rebuilding my entire life all over again from scratch. Because that's what it felt like at this stage. It really did feel like my entire life had just been swept away in one stroke. And I was unable to do anything for myself whatsoever. You know, never mind climbing mountains. I had to learn all of those everyday little things that most of us just do every day and take completely for granted. You know, just getting up out of bed in the morning, washing myself, dressing myself, feeding myself, going to the bathroom myself, all of these things. And at first, the prospect just seemed way too daunting for one person. I just didn't even know where to begin. I felt so utterly overwhelmed. I felt so completely incapable, and I felt often just so totally alone. So there were many occasions where I might have just thrown the towel in there and then, before I'd even really begun. So I do count myself as very fortunate that quite early on during this time, I did come to realize a couple of really important fundamental things about this great challenge that I faced. The things that in retrospect might seem quite obvious, but which weren't at all obvious to me at the time, and which did really help me to set myself onto that road to recovery. The first thing that I realized about this great challenge that I faced was that, of course, I wasn't facing it alone. In fact, I was completely surrounded by dozens, if not hundreds, of people who were there for me. There was the professional staff, the doctors and surgeons and nurses, therapists, prosthetists, each of these people with their own skills and talents, who were around my bedside 24 hours a day should I need them. They were all up for the challenge. There was my friends, my family, my girlfriend Anna, who were also around my bedside daily, who were also up for the challenge. And as I began to realize quite how many people there were whose help and support and care and encouragement and love I could depend upon at any moment, well, suddenly the challenge that I faced didn't seem quite so daunting after all. I just had to learn to swallow my pride and accept that help. You know, as a previously fiercely independent person, a very stubborn and proud mountaineer, it wasn't easy for me to accept that I couldn't do this alone, that I did need the help of other people. But once I got my head around that barrier and did begin to open up, to work with the people around me together as a team, we did start to make some very exciting progress. And meanwhile, the second thing that I was coming to realize about this enormous challenge that I faced was that, of course, it didn't have to be one big challenge, but like any challenge, it could just be broken down into many, many much more achievable, bite-sized pieces. You know, so rather than lying in bed all day and feeling sorry for myself, I would wake up each day, every day, and just set myself a goal. Set myself a small, achievable target that I felt I might meet that day. You know, I'd say to myself, okay, well, yesterday the nurses had to brush my teeth for me. Well, today, I'm going to do that myself. And I don't care if it takes me an hour or 2 hours or all day, because I've got all day. And so I would throw myself with as much enthusiasm as I could into this challenge that I'd set myself. And to my surprise, more often than not, I would achieve that challenge. I would reach that goal I'd set myself. And it might be difficult. It might take all day. It would certainly require a huge amount of support from the people around me, but somehow or other, I would get there. And that, of course, would be a small victory. That would be one small piece of my self-esteem won back. That would be one small step further down my road to rehabilitation and independence. So much so that I really didn't find it all that difficult to stay motivated during this time, because every day I was winning these small victories. Every day I was going to bed managing something that I couldn't do the day before. So of course I'm glossing over this massively, and of course it was a very difficult and frightening and confusing and scary time. But nevertheless, by constantly keeping myself motivated from goal to goal to goal, and with an enormous amount of help and support from everybody around me, I did learn once more over the course of just 3 months, using my new body to once again wash myself, dress myself, feed myself, go to the bathroom myself, all of these everyday things. And at the same time as that, of course, I was learning to walk again. Although I have to admit, I was a bit disappointed with the first pair of legs that I got, but these incredible, giant, one-size-fits-all inflatable legs are actually what you start with. Thankfully, after a couple of weeks, I was able to graduate onto a pair of fantastic, top-of-the-range, carbon fiber, titanium prosthetic legs. And that experience was just incredible, you know, just amazing. Having so recently woken up and looked down my hospital bed to see that my feet were gone forever, here I was just 3 months later, standing on my new legs, walking on my new feet. That gave me such a massive boost to my confidence and my self-esteem. And gave me the boost I needed to take the massive step of leaving the hospital and moving back home. Because as well as having these small goals, of course you have to have the big goals too. Something, the dream goal to work towards. And my dream goal was just that, was to leave behind the hospital and to live my life independently in my own home again. At this point, I still had no idea if I could manage in my own home. Even with the help of Anna, who would be there for me, I just didn't know. But if there was one thing I did know, was that I was never going to be 100% certain about this. If I was ever going to do it, at some point I just had to take the plunge and give it a go. And so learning to walk was what just tipped the scales and gave me the boost I needed to do that, to go out, to give it a go, and to move back home. And so once settled in back home, I did start to cope really well. And I still depended on Anna very heavily for many things. But essentially, I began to lead a relatively normal life again. And I suppose that might be the end of my story there, were it not for the fact that by now I had become pretty much addicted to this idea of setting myself challenges and achieving new things. I was enjoying this journey that I was on too much to stop there. I couldn't help myself from setting my sights further afield. And I couldn't help myself from turning my eyes once more to the hills and the mountains that I loved so much. So it was on a complete whim, really, about a week after I moved back home, still less than 4 months since the accident, I decided to go out and climb my first mountain. Although, to be fair, you probably wouldn't describe Blackford Hill, which is in the park in the centre of Edinburgh, as one of the world's most significant mountains. You know, it's hardly any taller than the Bolt Tower. But it's nevertheless standing on this summit with a wonderful 360-degree view round all over Edinburgh. I just felt on top of the world. I just felt incredible. And I guess I began to realize then that this flame of passion that I have for mountaineering hadn't been extinguished up there on Les Droites, but that the embers still burned within me. And I made up my mind that I was going to pursue this dream, crazy though it might seem, of returning to those hills and mountains once more. I still had no idea how I was going to go about this or what I might achieve beyond struggling up Blackford Hill. But I figured, well, why not? Why not? Just give it a go and take it one step at a time and see where I get to. And that's exactly what I did. So starting out with the smallest hill in Scotland, I just started climbing bigger and bigger hills, one step at a time. Until, to my surprise, only 1 year later, I found myself here on Ben Nevis, which is the biggest hill in Scotland and the UK. Still not a massive mountain at all, by any means, but it is a full 1,400 meters of hard, rough hiking from sea level to summit. And it was more than twice what I'd managed so far. So I had big doubts about this. But by this stage, the world's press had found out about it. So I think there was about a dozen journalists, a dozen photographers, and 3 film crews chasing me up the hillside. So I had no choice but to keep going. And after a long, hard slog, I did eventually make it to the summit. And I'm pictured there alongside Anna, who I'm very happy to report about 2 weeks later I was to get married to. So a much more important reason for celebrating then. And it perhaps goes without saying that I simply wouldn't be standing here speaking to you now if I hadn't been for all of the care and support and love that I've had from Anna throughout all of this and still do. And yet it's me that gets all the attention. It has been very much a journey that we made together. Well, at the same time as all this training for my hill walking that I was doing, I was becoming super passionate in my drive to get back and into all the outdoor pursuits and activities that I'd so much loved doing before my accident. And I just took the attitude that whatever it was my friends were doing, I would go along with them. And I would just give it a go and find out what was possible without hands and feet. So I have a few examples of some of those things here. Starting out with cross-country skiing. I've always been a passionate skier, mainly on the mountains. But first things first, I started on the flat. And as with so many of these things, I would spend a long time worrying about it and trying to solve the problems, working my head around the difficulties. But often, the more I did that, the more those difficulties just seemed to grow and grow, until eventually I would start to think that maybe it was all too difficult, maybe it was impossible, maybe I should just call it off. But if in the cold light of day I just cast aside those reservations and just went ahead and gave it a go, always, 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 I found those difficulties I'd been imagining in my head would just start evaporating in front of me. I'd often never have even been there in the first place. So cross-country skiing was a good example. In the end, despite my worries, it was simply a case of going along to the snow, pulling on some ski boots, clipping on some skis, and going skiing. Simple. It was just as easy as that. It worked absolutely fine. So, emboldened by that success, I thought, great, next I'm going to go snowboarding. And once again, I just fixed the snowboard onto my feet and went snowboarding. Quite literally, in fact, on this occasion, I didn't even bother wearing any boots. I just went in my normal shoes because I figured, well, I'm not going to get cold feet. So I was gradually realizing there's actually quite a few advantages of being an amputee, and no more cold toes. That's definitely one of them. From there, I plucked up the courage to try what I had thought would be impossible without hands and feet, which was, as I mentioned, downhill skiing. And as you can see here, in the end, it proved to be completely fine. Better than fine, in fact, in many ways, because I was forced by my physical limitations, I was forced by my disability to really focus on my technique, to really focus on what the skis were designed to do. So much so, in fact, that within a couple of years, I found I was actually skiing better than I had been before the accident. So I was really starting to find ways of turning my weaknesses into strengths. I've always been a passionate runner, and with these amazing carbon fiber titanium legs, it wasn't long before I could start running again. So within 6 months, I was running on the track. And before I knew it, I'd gone and made that classic schoolboy error and signed myself up for the London Marathon. So here I am, a year later, running my first marathon. But it's amazing how a big event like that can inspire you, can motivate you to bring out the most you have. And this was one of those occasions for me. The crowds, the runners, the spectators really kept me going through a very grueling and painful few hours. But I did eventually make it around the full 42.2 kilometers. Not the fastest marathon ever, perhaps, but at least I finished on the same day as everybody else, and that to me was achievement enough. I learned to sail, and with a few friends, a few years ago, we sailed across the North Sea as parts of the North Sea yacht race as an all-amputee crew. So there was 3 of us on the boat with 3 hands and 3 feet between us. Thankfully, that was enough. It was quite good for me because it meant every time the captain shouted, "All hands on deck," well, that lets me off the hook. But no, you don't get away with bad jokes when there's a captain on the ship. So we made, in the end, a very respectable 48 hours from Norway to Scotland. That was very exciting. And shortly after that, perhaps most grueling of all, I undertook an Ironman triathlon. So an Ironman involves a 3.8 kilometer swim in cold water in Scotland, followed by a 180 kilometer cycle ride, finished off with a full 42.2 kilometer marathon. So that was an epic 24-hour day on the go, non-stop. And that was just awful. It's just the only word I can use to describe that. Thank you. But never again. Thank you. Thank you. But never again, I tell you. Once you do an Ironman once, you never have to do it again. So that was great. But the one activity that was closest to my heart, that I dreamed about, that I knew in my heart was impossible without hands and feet, was, of course, climbing. Rock climbing, hands and feet are, after all, fundamental to the whole idea of clinging to a vertical rock face. Or so I thought, until once again I was persuaded by my friends to go along and give it a go. And to my astonishment, as much as to anybody else's, I found that I could invent new ways of clinging to that vertical rock face and clambering upwards. And actually, it was just the same as any other challenge. It was just the same process. It was just a case of learning to make the most of what I have, making the most of the tools that I have available. Now, most people have a pair of hands at the end of their arms, which are a fantastically versatile set of tools. I don't have the hands anymore, but I've still got these, my arms or my stumps and my elbows, and they are very versatile too. You know, they bend and flex and rotate. They're strong. They've got good grip and good sensitivity, and so I can do a lot with that. I do everything with that, and climbing proved no exception. And I was soon managing quite difficult rock climbs, and for me that was just wonderful. Being back in the outdoors with my friends, doing the activity I loved the most, meant a great deal to me. Well then, next, I thought, that's rock climbing. What about ice climbing? So to go ice climbing, you might know you need to be able to hold 2 ice axes, one in each hand. So that meant paying another visit to go and see my poor, long-suffering prosthetists. Now, prosthetists, I don't know whether it's a word you can translate in your own minds, but they're the people who make my legs, any arms that I use, and in fact, any other tools or gadgets they will make for me. They've pulled out all the stops on so many occasions. They've been brilliant. On this occasion, it did take a while for them to persuade their bosses that this was yet another great way of spending UK taxpayers' money, but we did get the go-ahead to design and build Britain's first pair of national health ice axes. And here they are in operation, climbing up a frozen waterfall in Scotland a few years ago. So, thank you. So, thanks. Thank you. So, now that I was ice climbing, rock climbing, climbing the biggest mountains in the UK, I really felt that all the skills were in place now. All the tools were there for me to be able to write what I considered to be the final chapter in this story of my rehabilitation, for me to be able to complete the circle, if you like, to return to climb in the mountains where it all happened in the first place, to climb once again in the mountains of the French and Swiss and Italian Alps. And that was an amazing experience. It was hard, of course. It was hard physically, it was hard mentally, it was hard emotionally, but it was important to me. It was part of my process of healing, of coming through my cycle of grief. And so it was very cathartic. And it was also great to be able to go back and climb with so many of the people involved in my story out there, the rescuers, the doctors and nurses and surgeons. As I said, many of them were mountaineers themselves. Many of them had felt at the time, as I had, that this whole sorry affair had been an abject failure, that I would have been better off dying up there on the mountain. So it was important for me to go back, to climb with those people, and in my own way thank them, show them that their efforts hadn't been to no avail, that an active person can still lead a rich and rewarding life, almost no matter what. Since those early days, I've been back climbing and skiing in the mountains more times than I can count, and many of those people have become lifelong friends. I'm going to mention one last mountain, though, a mountain many of you might recognize. In fact, it's this mountain here. It's called the Matterhorn, or Le Cervin, on the Swiss-Italian border. And it's one of the most instantly recognizable, iconic mountains in the world. You know, even if you've never set foot on a mountain, you've probably opened a bar of Swiss chocolate or, seen it on any poster for Switzerland. And it's, even by modern standards, it's not an easy mountain to climb. And what's more, when you've climbed it, there's no easy way down. There's no easy way off the back. There's no cable car. you've got to climb back down the way you came. And that's inevitably the most dangerous moment. So it's a mountain that commands a great deal of respect, and one which for many years I never have even dreamt would be possible for a person without hands and feet. But it is remarkable, I think, how often what can start out as just a silly idea, a thought, if you let it linger long enough up here, can somehow get itself lodged and start to sprout and grow, and before you know it, you have a dream. And well, then I always think once you have a dream, once you dare to express it out loud, then it becomes so much easier to achieve. Because then you just have to do all the same stuff you did last time. You start planning, you start preparing, you start trying things and failing, trying new things and putting in place everything you need, the equipment, the training, the people, the knowledge, the weather, all those things, just working towards it one step at a time. So I'm not going to go into any great detail, but enough to say that it did take 5 years in the end of my mountaineering time, during which I nearly gave up on several occasions. But thankfully, I persisted and didn't give up, because in the end, on the 4th of August, 2016, I found myself in the right place, at the right time, with the right people and the right equipment and the right weather forecast. And then suddenly, everything just fell into place. And climbing the Matterhorn without hands and feet that day was easy, because the hard work had already been done. The hard work was getting to the bottom of the mountain, standing there, looking up and knowing that I could do this. That was the hard bit. Climbing it proved to be a complete joy. So starting out on the lowest rocks first thing in the morning, here I am just a few hours later on the highest snow slopes, with the tiny village of Zermatt nestled now 3,000 meters lower down below us in the valley. And a few steps further on the summit. And there on the left and the right are my true friends, colleagues, guides, Steve Jones and Steve Monks, without whom I simply couldn't have done it. And myself there in the middle, feeling both very secure and very pleased with myself that I proved to myself yet again, and to others too, I hope, that if I only allow myself to dream big, but start small, work towards it one step at a time, with persistence and patience and diligence, I can eventually, ultimately, achieve even the most difficult of things. So, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Jamie Andrew.
Thank you. No. Wait a minute. Thank you. But we're not quite finished.
Sorry.
Because the biggest challenge I've had to face in my life, I've yet to even mention. The biggest challenge by far, in fact, was, and still is, these three people here. These are my three kids. On the left, thank you. On the left is Levi, who's now 18 years old. On the right are the twins, which was a complete shock. Liam and Alex, they're now 16 years old. And believe me, they're a hell of a big challenge. I mean, climbing mountains without hands and feet turns out to be easy compared to just bringing up three normal, healthy kids. As I'm sure many of you will appreciate, just don't even ask me about changing diapers with my teeth. I wait for the translation later to catch up with that one. The important point is, though, that life goes on. If I had died up there on the mountain, as I'd wished in those early days following the accident, well, these three guys would never have even got the chance to go on and experience this incredible gift that we all have called life. So to me now, it doesn't really matter so much what I can and can't do. It doesn't matter what my disability is. I just feel privileged to have had the opportunity to pass the mantle on to the next generation. And right now, as we speak, somewhere out there on the site, those 3 kids are wandering around having a great time at a Colours of Ostrava festival. So we have the festival organizers to thank for that too. But that really is the end of my story. I really hope that you have enjoyed it, and perhaps you can take some things from it, because I know that mountaineering is not everybody's cup of tea, but what I said at the beginning was the most important thing. I was just an ordinary person. I had no idea any of this was going to happen to me. And so I've come to believe that actually all of us have great strength. All of us have enormous potential. Sometimes it takes great adversity to bring that out, but it doesn't have to be that way. If you can learn to take inspiration, if you can learn to make the most of the things that you have, if you can learn to make the most of all the incredible people around you, and if you can learn to simply believe in yourself, well then truly anything becomes possible. So that really is it. I would like to say thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure, and thanks for having me. Thank you.
I don't even dare to step into your applause because it really is deserved. I just want to have 2 more questions. First of all, I think it's very important to understand what happened throughout these first 3 sessions here in Mentalpot. We were brought into close proximity to discomfort. First with Wim Hof through the ice, then through Frederick Imbo, through not taking things personally, and then through your journey, the discomfort, I don't think we can imagine bigger discomfort than what you had to go through and what you were able to discover. I know probably many things have changed, but I just want to say thank you for allowing us to be in proximity with that, not just with the discomfort, but also with the level of your freedom, with being humble and being grateful for everything that's happening. So thank you for that. I want to ask you, now we are living in a world of biotech, people are hacking their bodies, and you became partly, robotic.
Robotic.
Partly robotic.
Yeah, no, I'm mostly still human, but
yes.
we're getting there. We're getting there. But as you notice, I kind of like to have my arms free because I'm as a climber, I like to touch things, I like to feel. So I don't tend to wear high-tech robotic arms, but the progression in the technology has been amazing.
And that is my question, because how did your relationship to this enhancement, like exoskeletons and the Elon Musk's Neuralink, are you a fan or?
I'm a big technology fan. I'm an engineer by training. I love all that stuff, and my legs, although they're not electronic, they are high-tech pieces of engineering that I can take off at nighttime, but nevertheless, when I'm wearing them, they are part of me. I really feel that my feet are a part of me. So it's interesting to see how you can redefine in your mind where the human body ends and
is it the skin, right? Is it the room?
It changes. I think it changes depending on your situation. And if you put on a diving suit, that becomes the extension of your body. Or if you're an astronaut in a spacesuit, or if you're using tools in a workshop, those tools can become an extension of your body. And it's the same with the equipment that I use.
I want to just give a chance. Is there any question? I don't want to be selfish. And pokud je nějaká otázka tady mezi vámi, tak je teď ten čas, tamhle. Pojďte mi ji zakřičet, já ji zopakuju. Have you ever come back to the same mountain where this all happened?
I have, but I did cheat a little bit because I went in a helicopter. So there was a French TV crew they were making a documentary about my story, and they took me up and we flew over. But it was interesting because we flew over the mountain and I could look down on the spot where we were trapped, and there was no sign of any human traces there. They'd long gone. And it made me realize that, you know, the mountain doesn't care. The mountain's just a lump of snow and ice and rock. And really, I couldn't hold any blame or any bad feeling in the mountain because this was a human tragedy. This was my journey to come to terms with what had happened. So it gave me the knowledge and the strength to work on that so that now I can feel there is no blame in that mountain or any other for this tragedy. It's up to it was up to me to come to terms with it personally. Thank you. I should just add, while I've got the chance, if there's any more questions or you think of them later, I'm going to be speaking in the Game Changers stage at 7 o'clock, I think, today. At a more relaxed sort of chat, and there'll be chances to ask questions then if you want, I think. So do come along if you want to get into a more in-depth conversation about it.
Okay. So I think we're done here. Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Jamie
Cool.
Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.